You're about to hear a message from our series, The Beginnings, a chapter-by-chapter study of the book of Genesis. In this series, we're discovering how God gives new beginnings over and over again. Grab your Bibles and let's prepare our hearts as we hear a word from God.
How long are you willing to wait for God's promises to come to pass in your life personally? How long are you willing to wait for what God said he's going to do without losing faith? Now, we left off last week with Abram, who found himself discouraged and in some depression because he didn't have a son, an heir. The desire of his heart to have a child with his wife Sarai, but they were unable to bear children. And so God shows up and gives Abram a promise. And that promise was that you will have more descendants than the stars of the sky. I will make your descendants into a great nation, and I will give you a great family. And so Abram gets this promise from God, and we saw how when we receive God's promises and believe God's promises, how it lifts us out of that discouragement. And so Abram is encouraged for a season. And we saw last time the greatest way to get out of discouragement is to stop looking at what's going on around us and start looking at the promises that God has given to us. And so Abram is encouraged. But what happens when what God said doesn't look like what you currently see? And weeks go by, months go by, maybe even for some years go by, and you're still waiting for God to do what he said he was going to do. How long are you willing to wait for God's promises to come to pass? And now in Genesis chapter 16, from the time that Abram got this promise, time has gone by. And it says in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 16, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him. So God gives Abram this promise, but Sarai, his wife, still is unable to bear a child. And so now Abram does what we often do in our lives. We begin to doubt the promises of God. Did I really hear God clearly? Did God really say this to me? And it's the same thing that the enemy tries to do in our minds constantly, is to draw a question mark over the promises of God for our lives personally. He did it all the way back in the beginning of time in the Garden of Eden, when God told Adam and Eve what was going to happen. And Satan shows up and says, did God really say? And Satan will always try to tempt us with the promises of God that will keep us going in the right direction. That, did God really say that to you? Is that really for you? And like Abram, we start to wonder what's going to happen. Can I believe the Lord? He gave me this promise, and I've been encouraged for a day or a two or a month or three. But then some time goes by, and I haven't seen anything change. God gave me this promise. He was going to restore. God gave me this promise. He was going to heal. God gave me this promise. He was going to provide. But I don't see it. And nothing has changed. My situation has been the same for the last 6 days or 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years or for some even 6 decades. And it doesn't look like God is going to do what he said he would do. My child's been a prodigal, you might say, for years now, and I've been praying. My spouse, she's been acting this way for a long time. I don't think there's any hope of her changing. My health, the financial situation, the addiction, whatever it might be. And because you don't see it, we can start to question it. Did God really say? Did I hear him right? Was this promise for me? But we have to realize something in our lives, that between the promise of God and the performance of that promise, God almost always allows there to be a period of time. Abram was given this promise for a son, but ultimately he had to wait 25 years for this promise to come to pass. Noah was given a promise by God that God was going to flood the world and that Noah was to build an ark. And Noah had to wait 100 years for that promise to come to pass without ever seeing a cloud in the sky. Abram, Noah, you see the Israelites, they were enslaved in Egypt for 430 years, waiting for the promised deliverer to deliver them out of their slavery. Moses was under the hand of God in the wilderness for 40 years before Moses would be raised up as that deliverer. Joshua and Caleb, they waited 40 years in the wilderness for the previous generation to die off before God could use the next generation, because the last generation didn't have enough faith that God would do what he said he would do. They didn't believe the promises of God was for them. And so they were kept from receiving all that God had for them, and God would use the next generation of Israel to take the promised land. Joseph, he was under the hand of God for at least 13 years in that waiting room, enslaved in Potiphar's house and in the prison before God could take him into the palace. Why does God wait to fulfill his promises? When God says, I'm going to do it, why doesn't he just do it right away? Have you ever wondered that? When God gives you a promise, how come just like the next day it doesn't happen? Why would a loving father give a promise and then wait to complete the promise? Why would God make us wait? 3 reasons. I want you to write these down, hold on to these, and take these with you. First, number 1, to produce patience within you. To produce patience within you. Just because we don't see God working does not mean that God is not working. Because God oftentimes works behind the scenes. And that's why Hebrews chapter 6 verse 12 tells us, don't become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promise. Notice that. Through faith and patience, they are the ones that inherited the promises of God. You have to have faith in God, believing that God is going to do what he said he's going to do. But also, that faith needs to be paired with patience, waiting for the timing of God for him to do what he said he's going to do. Church, God's timing is so important. God's timing is perfect. And oftentimes when we try to make God's promises come to pass in our timing, we make a mess of our lives, we make a mess of the situation, we make a mess of everything, and then because of the mess, we end up experiencing misery needlessly. We'll see in our text today, that's what happens with Abram and his wife Sarah. They made a mess of their family and a mess of their marriage, because they try to do things in their time, not God's. And so God will wait to fulfill that promise to produce a patience within us. And we are to imitate those who obtained, they received the promise that God had for them because they patiently endured. We have to understand that when you're in the lobby of a restaurant, waiting to be seated, if it's managed well, the only reason why you're waiting is because they are preparing a table for you. They're getting it ready, they're getting the table set, and they're preparing the thing so that when you walk back, everything is ready for you to step into it. Now, the same thing is true. Jesus even said that I go to prepare a table for you. The psalmist declares that God prepares a table for us. What is that talking about? That God is working while we are waiting. And that when God is working and we are waiting, oftentimes, like if you're anything like me at a restaurant, you're thinking, what are they even doing? Like, what's taking them so long? I mean, it's been at least 5 minutes. I mean, can't they figure it out by now? Because we're naturally so impatient. We want everything now. We want everything right away. That's why when we go through drive-thrus, oftentimes they have these counters in the window. Because if they don't serve your food in the first 60 seconds that you come up to the window, your food is free. If you're anything like me, you're like waiting 58, 59, and then they give you, oh man, I was 1 second off. We are so impatient and we want everything now. And it should be no surprise to us that when it comes to waiting for the promises of God, oftentimes because we are waiting, we think that God is doing nothing. But God is working all things out together for good. And just because it's behind closed doors or behind the scenes does not mean that God isn't setting things up to fulfill his promise to you. They obtained the promise after they patiently endured. You see, God gives there a period of time for there to be a period of time to grow our faith. If I can see what God is doing, let me ask you this: how much faith does it take? Not very much. If I know how it's going to work out, how much faith does that take? Very little. But when I can't see what's going on, it's when my faith is then activated and required. Faith to believe that God is working, because the Bible tells us that we are called to walk by faith and not by sight. I'm so proud of you guys. We are called to walk by faith, not by sight. So then why is it that when we can't see what God's doing, we freak out? We begin to worry, get anxious over everything, when God says, this is how I've called you to walk. If you're going to continue to walk with God, then you're going to need greater faith in your life. And so God gives there a period of time to grow your faith so that you are not lacking in your faith. I am convinced that too many people never see what God would have done because they stopped believing that God would do what he said he would do. They give up on the marriage because, well, month after month, year after year, God promised that he would restore my marriage, but I haven't seen anything change in my spouse yet. Month after month, year after year, well, God promised that he was going to do this, but I don't see it yet. We stop believing what God said he would do because what we see currently doesn't look like what God said. People that are not willing to wait long enough for God to accomplish what he was going to accomplish in his time. And so God allows there to be a period of time, number one, to produce patience. Secondly, write this down. God allows there to be a period of time between his promise and the performance of his promise. Number two, to produce preparation. When it comes to God fulfilling his promises, church, it is not procrastination. That God is like, listen, I'm going to get around to it. I just, one day, I'll get around to it. And that God is putting off his promise to you. And it's not preoccupation either, where God's like, listen, I'm really busy. I got some bigger deals to deal with. I got, a war in the Middle East, between my people, Israel. It's kind of consuming a lot of my time. So, your problems are pretty insignificant compared to the bigger issues of the world. We think of God that way oftentimes, like, God doesn't have time for my problems. God is omnipresent, the Bible declares. That is, God is everywhere. And God is omniscient, meaning he is all-knowing. God is not limited by any problem, nor is God complexed with all the problems that every person has. God's available to every person 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because God does not grow weary. The Bible declares that God does not faint, that God does not tire. We can go to God with everything. So it's not preoccupation, it's not procrastination, it is for preparation. God is preparing you for what is ahead of you by growing your faith in what you are doing and going through currently. In other words, God has to prepare you for what he has prepared for you. You can tweet that. God is preparing you for what he has prepared for you. And so God allows there to be a period of time to produce preparation. Not only to produce patience, and number two, to produce preparation. But the third reason why God allows there to be a period of time between his promise and the performance of that promise is this: to produce perseverance. God doesn't want you to be a weak Christian. to have a lack of faith, to have no perseverance when it comes to difficulty. And when you experience the resistance, the struggle, listen, there is strength that comes from the struggle. I started working out with a few guys from our church. Tyler, who does announcements, he's a big dude, so I was like, I should work out with him. And then, Dustin, that guy is just hardcore, so I'm like, I'll work out with him. And I haven't worked out in the last 3 days because I have a pinched nerve in my neck, and I can't look this way. So if I turn to look at you, it's going to be like this today. And, these guys are hardcore. But one thing that I've been discovering is it's painful. It's hard. But with the struggle comes strength. If you do what's easy your whole life, you'll never be strengthened. And so God takes you through some things that cause you to struggle. You might start with the 5-pounders, and it's hard. And you want to cry like I was the other day. And you want to, it's so hard and painful. But then eventually you keep struggling with that. It's going to come to a point where that's no longer a struggle. You're going to have strength from the struggle. And so God doesn't want you to be a weakling, a Christian who has no fortitude. And so God allows there to be a period of time to produce within you something that would not be in existence in your character, and that is perseverance. And that's why Romans chapter 5, verse 3 says, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials. Now, a lot of times when people read this verse in Romans chapter 5, verse 3, a lot of people think, what? I can rejoice when I go through various trials? I mean, that sounds like something that has some psycho tendencies, like some psychotic behaviors, like, oh, I'm so happy I'm going through problems. But that's not what Paul is declaring to the church in Rome. He is saying that we can count it joy, we can rejoice when we go through trials. Not that we are going through trials, not that we're happy that we are going through trials, but we can rejoice when we go through trials for the reason of what those trials will bring about in our lives. And so he goes on to say, for we know that they help us develop perseverance, and perseverance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. God will allow there to be a period of time to produce something within your character that would not be in existence without that difficulty and that time, that period of time in which you would need to wait, that you would continue to persevere in what God has called you to currently. Joshua and the walls of Jericho, perhaps you're familiar with the story. They would walk around the walls once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, 7 times around the walls of Jericho. Never once are we told while they walked around those walls that the walls began to shake or dust began to fall from the cracks. Never one stone being tipped off by God, just like as a sign to keep them going. Nothing changed. Nothing looked different. But as they continued to persevere and do what God called them to do, after the 7th day, after the 7th time on that 7th day, we saw the walls came tumbling down. But God, in order to build their perseverance, God would first have them walk through the wilderness for 40 years. So that after walking through the wilderness, that they would be ready for when the time came to do what God said to do and walk around the walls of Jericho. God wants to produce patience and preparation and perseverance in our faith. And just because you don't see what God is doing does not mean that God is not working. You don't have to see it to believe it. You are going to need to wait, to trust, and to have faith so that your faith will continue to grow in that time. If you've ever seen a caterpillar spin a cocoon, it's pretty amazing how it does that. And then it crawls into its own cocoon, and then that caterpillar liquefies within the cocoon. In that process of metamorphosis that you learned about in 5th grade science. And that process, metamorphosis, is what the Bible actually uses to talk about the change of life from when you repent of your sins and you turn to God, how there should be a change in your life. You were once a caterpillar, slimy slime ball. sticky fingers. You once were something that was kind of just creepy. But then when you are transformed, metamorphosis, the Bible uses to talk about that word, that what you break out of that cocoon is something beautiful, something that will soar. Now listen, if you ever see a butterfly struggling to get out of that cocoon, and you see that cocoon shaking, or the butterfly looks like he's stuck in his cocoon, whatever you do, do not help the butterfly escape from the cocoon. Now it looks like the butterfly is gonna die. It looks like it's gonna, struggle to death. But do you know it's in that struggle that the blood actually flows into the wings and gives the butterfly the ability to fly? And without that struggle, it would never have the strength to soar. And so too in our lives, the picture, the metamorphosis, the transformation, without the struggle, you would never have the strength to soar, as the Bible calls us to. That you could run and not grow weary. That you could rise up with wings of eagles, and that you would soar. That you would not be those that would faint and grow weary, but those that would be able to continue by faith through whatever it is that God has you walking through. God allows us to go through things to prepare us for what He has for us next. And God knows the strength that you will need to rise above the things that you've been currently walking through. If there is no struggle, there is no strength. If there isn't a fight, there's no flying. Faith has to be exercised. So between the promises of God and the performance of that promise, there's a period of time. But here's the problem. In that period of time that we saw a few weeks ago, we call the waiting room. We try to make things happen before God accomplishes the work in us. And when we try to make God's promise come to pass before we're ready for that promise, we make a bigger mess and a greater misery in our lives. And that's what happens in the life and family of Abram and Sarai. Look at verse 1. It says, "But she, Sarai, had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. And so Sarai said to Abram, 'The Lord has prevented me from having children, so go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her.' And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan." So, the problem, number one, the problem. I don't see how God's promise could come true in my life. Sarai says, "Abram, listen, I know what God told you, but let's be practical. You're upwards of 90 years old now. I'm in my 80s. We're past the point of having a baby. There's a massive problem. So after the problem comes the proposal. Let's just make this happen. Let's help God out. Let's try to hurry up the plan of God." This is what I call expedience without obedience. This is practical, Abram. This seems like this would be a viable solution. Listen, I'm getting older. You're not getting any younger. So this is what seems logical. But not only was it logical, but it's what was accepted in culture. That was the common practice. If a woman of value and worth had a servant and she was unable to bear children, that her servant often would be that surrogate mother for that woman. And so this was a common practice in culture. So she says, "Take my maidservant Hagar." Interesting, Hagar's name means the ensnaring one. And this would be something that would be completely acceptable. This wouldn't be a scandal. This isn't something that people would watch on, reality television. This isn't something that would make the tabloids. This is something that was just a common practice in culture in that day. But where did this woman Hagar come from? They acquired Hagar when Abram and Sarai went to Egypt after God told them to go to the land of Canaan. But if you remember, there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and so they left because what seemed practical was for them to go to Egypt where there was more food. God never told them to go to Egypt, and then Abram lied. Sarah was taken by Pharaoh. Pharaoh made her his wife and then found out she was married because God showed up and redeemed and saved their marriage when their marriage looked so far gone. But the point is this: when Abram went to where he wasn't supposed to be, where God never told him to go, he ended up encountering problems that he would still be paying for today. And this is what always happens when you compromise. When you go to the places of the world, Egypt in the Bible is a picture of the world. And when you go to the places of the world, the places where the world hangs out, the worldly places, I don't need to spell it out for you. You know where those places are in your own life. Those places that you know that you shouldn't be, that God hasn't called you to go to, but you go anyways because it's practical, it's logical, or you make compromises. And so when you go to those places where you were at, where you shouldn't be, oftentimes you will find snares, Hagars, the ensnaring one. There will be snares in your life that will trap you and keep you from what God has intended for your life. Abram listened to the voice of his wife. He didn't seek the Lord, he just listened to his wife. She says, Abram, I want you to sleep with this beautiful young woman, my servant. Abram goes, okay, you got it. No problem. And so now Abram has, he has two problems now, no longer just one. Abram makes a mess of his situation. Two women in his life, double the trouble. And I remember walking and seeing in this window of a general store, there was Valentine cards on display. And I'll never forget this. It said, the Valentine card says, I love you only. And below it says, now available in multi-packs. What? Some of you just went, listen, Valentine cards, I love you only, now available in multi-packs. Why would you need multi-packs of a card that says, I love you only? Okay, now you're getting it. You're welcome. Just wait, like 5 minutes, someone in the back's gonna start laughing. So Abram now has this problem. So we go from the problem to the proposal, now to the price. Look at verse 4. So Abram had relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, this is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now she's pregnant. She treats me with contempt. The Lord will show you who's wrong, you or me. Now here's the price. Hagar doesn't like Abram because he's married to Sarai. Sarai doesn't like Abram because he did what he did with Hagar. This is what we call a lose-lose situation. And now there's trouble in his family, but also not only trouble in his family then, but there's trouble throughout all of history. For Hagar, that son that Abram would have with Hagar was named Ishmael. And Ishmael goes on to father the Arab nations, who would be constantly at enmity with his brother. And you see, Abram has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. God changes Jacob's name to Israel, which means governed by God. Israel fathers the nation of Israel, and the Arab nations through Ishmael are at constant war from the beginning of time with Israel, between Israel and the Arab nations. And now you can begin to understand why there's the conflict in the Middle East. It goes back to this mistake. That Abram tried to make God's promises come to pass, and he makes a massive mess out of his family and out of the nation. And this is what always happens inevitably when we take matters into our own hands and try to take over for God. Church, don't miss this. It was out of the lack of faith that they had that brought them to this point where they would follow through with a whole series of these problems. Sarai blames Abram for doing that when it was her idea, because it's often easier to blame others than to acknowledge fault and ask for forgiveness of ourselves. And Abram refuses to get involved in the solution to the problem that he helped create. Hey, it's not my problem. This is between you two. You two take care of it. And Abram replies in verse 6, and he says, "Look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. And the angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she replied. And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." Then he added, "I will give you more descendants than you can count." And the angel also said, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives." Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord who had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me." And she also said, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me?" So that well was named Beer Lahai Roy, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Hagar, because of the hostility within the family, she runs from the family. And it says the angel of the Lord appeared to her. The angel of the Lord is a phrase that you'll see pop up throughout the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord is a unique phrase that's in reference to Jesus Christ before he came as Jesus, the babe born in Bethlehem. This is an appearance, a Christophany. And the angel of the Lord shows up to a woman who was running from where she was supposed to be. The first place that we see Jesus show up is to a person far from where they're supposed to be in their life, to bring them back to where they need to be. And the Lord reveals himself to her. He tracks her down and makes himself known to her. Know this today. Maybe you aren't where you should be. Maybe you found yourself in problems needlessly, trying to take control of your own life, and maybe you found yourself far from the family of God. But even when you find yourself far from the family of God, far from God, everything seems to be going wrong. Listen, God can still show up right where you're at and make himself known to you. If you are a Christian here today, then you have a decision. Will I wait for in that period of time that God is allowing to grow my faith, or will I get ahead of God and make a mess out of the situation? Maybe you're here today and you would say, "You know what? I've made a mess out of that situation. I've made a mess out of my marriage. I've made a mess out of my family. I've made a mess." But like God did with Hagar, God still can come after you, reveal himself to you, and still bring you back to where you need to be in the family of faith. Maybe you've been running from God because of how someone has treated you. Maybe someone in the family of God has acted wrongly towards you. And because of that, maybe you stopped going to church, or there's been some church hurt in your life. Listen, people of faith do wrong things. But know this, God will never fail you. People are imperfect, but God is perfect. And so if you keep your eyes on Jesus and walk obediently before Jesus, he will get you to where you need to be. And he sees what you're going through. He knows it. He loves you and has a promise already to put it back together again. So what's it going to be? Am I going to be a desperate person? A desperate housewife of Canaan? Sarai and Hagar, desperate housewives. Desperate to make their plans happen before God's timing. Or am I going to be someone that submits to God's will, God's plan, and his timing, and see God's promises come to pass? Don't stop believing. I remember when I was first preparing this message, the window was open, And I was praying, God, I need a closer. I want something to be this powerful closer to summarize this message. But God, I don't know how to end it. I don't know how to land this plane. And I'm thinking, Lord, what do you want me to do? I'm praying. And all of a sudden, I hear this song blasting. I'm like, what? Who's blasting music? Don't they know I'm trying to study? I mean, don't they understand that doesn't the whole community revolve around me here? I mean, don't they understand? I'm like, what song is that? I'm listening. And it goes, don't stop believing. I said, okay, God, I know what you want me to tell the people. God can even use Journey. Who knew? Don't stop believing. God will do what he said he's going to do.
Thank you for joining us today. We pray you were blessed by the biblical truths revealed in today's message. We are always encouraged to hear how God is using this ministry to touch lives. If God has been transforming your life through this ministry, or if you would like to help support this ministry financially, you can go to our website, cceagle.com. Being in a community with believers is essential to the life of a Christian, and we would love to be in fellowship with you no matter where you're joining us from in the world or in what season of life you're in. We hope you'll join us again at Calvary Chapel Eagle.